Welcome into a National Signing Day edition of the Husker247 podcast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Michael Bruntz. As mentioned, it is National Signing Day. Nebraska has signed how many folks? Michael Bruntz, what are we at? What's the running count at this point?
I'm getting to my numbers here. So we as we sit here at 11:15, Nebraska has signed 19. Commitment Barry Jackson still nothing from him yet, and
We'll dive into Barry Jackson in a little bit.
And 5 transfers currently in the class who will not sign, but are considered part of that class. So that's where we stand.
24 total?
Yes.
19 plus 5, is that the math that we can do here?
Yeah, that's the limit to my abilities.
I highly doubt that. I bet you can get all the way up to 30.
Maybe.
But this class could maybe get to 30. We'll see. So Nebraska with 19 signatures right now. There's still some decisions yet to have happened, including Vincent Carroll Jackson, a Syracuse commitment. Nebraska is involved with multiple transfer portal players, Elijah Judy and Cornelius, the right tackle for Rhode Island. Ajani, is that right? Ajani Cornelius. So you have Ben Scott, the offensive lineman from Arizona State. So there's still some decisions out there, and there's still some names. Eric Fields, we're not sure if he's going to be making a decision during this signing period. There's still some things out there for Nebraska, but they have 24 right now in their class, 19 of which have signed. Arguably none bigger than Malachi Coleman, who Nebraska just picked up on Wednesday. He made an announcement Wednesday morning that he was going to be having another recruiting announcement coming at 10:45. And at that time, he committed to Nebraska for the second time. So Malachi doing everything in twos, 2 official visits to Nebraska, 2 commitments to Nebraska, but just 1 signature. Bruntz, what does it mean for Matt Rhule and this staff to keep Malachi Coleman at home?
It's a big win. And especially from a perception point of view. I mean, I think everybody understands that he's got, some of the elite tools in this class, not just in Nebraska's class, but nationally, as a guy who's 6'5", that goes, 10-4 in the 100 meters. Those guys don't just hop off the bus every day. And this was one that was really important for Matt Rhule to get. I mean, Malachi Coleman had said, that Mickey Joseph had been such a huge part of his recruitment. He opened his recruitment after, Mickey Joseph was not going to be, it was pretty obvious he wasn't going to be the head coach. And Matt Rhule and his staff made Malachi Coleman a huge priority. They beat out kind of the hard-charging Colorado Coach Prime group and their Lamborghinis and their expensive luggage. And
how does a Buffalo get in a Lamborghini? That doesn't make sense.
Through the door, I think.
Through the door.
Yeah,
that's what you got for me.
That's all I got. So it was big. It was a big win. We'll see where he ends up playing on, which side of the ball, how early he can get on the field, a lot of other stuff. But in terms of kind of the guy that Nebraska had to have, I think Malachi Coleman was at the top for a class that, what, they have 8 or 9 now? 8 in-state guys? 9 in-state guys?
8
in this class?
8 in-state guys.
So, it's a banner year in Nebraska for in-state guys, and Malachi Coleman was one that they had to get.
Are you at all surprised? So Malachi Coleman becomes the latest to commit and sign with this class. He was committed to Scott Frost and he was committed to Mickey Joseph and that version of Nebraska's recruiting class back in October. Are you at all surprised, Bruntz, at how many of those commitments Nebraska has kept together here in this 2023 crop? I mean, you run through the 19 guys that have signed, more than half of them were already committed to Nebraska prior to Matt Rhule arriving. They've been able to play defense just as well as they've sort of played offense. And as we know, having covered, multiple transitions now, that's not always the case.
No, it's hard to do, and I think one thing that kind of worked in their favor was because it was a little bit more of a regional type class, that it's a little bit easier to, be around those guys, to, make an impact earlier rather than, let's say, a kid's in Florida or something like that and having to get down and build that relationship from a distance. So I think that helps them. But no, I think, they picked the guys that they wanted to keep. I think they worked hard to build those relationships. And I think, and you can maybe speak to this too, but I've been impressed by how organized they've been. They covered a lot of ground, and they covered a lot of ground, not necessarily, I mean, they don't have a full staff yet even. So I guess what's in your mind, I mean, what stands out about the way that this, initial class has come together, given, it's again a transition class. They had 3 weeks to do it, and people need to remember that, more than a few of these coaches were not in college football last year either.
Yeah, I think the remarkable thing is that they hit the ground kind of running. I mean, you go back to that first week, he has his introductory press conference on Monday, all the pomp and circumstance of that. And then the rest of the week is sort of him setting things up with his team, him trying to hire a couple coaches, and then getting out on the road on Friday, going into high schools, going into commitments homes, or in the case of Malachi Coleman, an uncommitted Malachi Coleman. That was one of his first stops. I think one thing they've done really well is they figured out which kids they have to kind of play up the recruitment to, and Malachi might be one of those. And they did it right away. It wasn't like we'll get to him when we get to him. It's no, we got to make this kid a priority. We're going to make him priority. We're going to make him feel like he's a priority, and that's what they did. I mean, they got him back on that Sunday. They had that in-state visit that went really well, that I think kind of set a tone for a number of 24s and 25s and 26s. We can dive into that a little bit in the comments that Rhule and Ed Foley and others have made already here on Wednesday morning. But the big thing is they just kept showing that, what they're saying is true. It's one thing if you just repeatedly say, we want to keep Nebraska kids at home. It's another when you show up in the schools, when you show up in home, when you repeatedly are about what you say you are, it stands out. And, we'll dive into this, I'm sure, in a little greater detail. One of the guys they couldn't get, Benny Nagoy, they pushed all the way to signing day with Iowa State, who had, a pretty comfortable lead. They end up signing him, but they made that really tough. And, Benny's a kid that in normal circumstances, this staff would have taken and would have had committed by, I don't know, April of last spring. And so that's the kind of thing that they don't want to see happen. But what they did with 3 of the 4 major kids that are leaving the state, they got in home with Ben Bramer and they made their pitch. He still chose Iowa State, but at least the Bramer family knows that Rhule wanted him and all of that. With Benny, the same thing. He still chose Iowa State, but he knows the door is open. If he happens to get to Ames and decide this isn't where I want to be, I want to go back to Lincoln, that door is open. And then we haven't talked about this a lot, Bruntz. They did the same thing with Zane Flores. They made sure they got into Gretna. They made sure they talked to Gretna's coach. They made sure they talked to Zane. And they basically said, hey, we get you're going to sign with Oklahoma State, but we're here. If whatever reason, if this doesn't result in you going from Stillwater to the NFL, if you need another stop along the way, we're right here in Lincoln. We're big fans. We'd love to have you. Best of luck to you. We'll catch you next time. I think that attitude is really big. I think that's the kind of thing that's going to be valuable in this transfer portal era, where if you don't get the recruit on the front side of the recruitment, there's a good chance you could get them on the next one. Or you might have a better chance of the next one if you leave that relationship strong. So we'll see how that all plays out. But they did a really nice job of being about what they said they were going to be. And that doesn't always happen.
Yeah. I mean, it is impressive the number of recruits in this class who have said that they felt like Nebraska made them a priority. And that goes for the in-state kids. I know both of the guys that from Omaha West Side that signed after, or that committed after Matt Rhule was here. both of them very much felt that way. Jalen Lloyd, especially, you know, gets an offer from Nebraska 45 minutes after Matt Rhule's announced as the head coach. I mean, that's a strong signal to a very talented in-state athlete that, Nebraska takes him seriously as a football player. And I think it's hard to do, to kind of focus your attention in so many different areas when you're, probably having to learn where the heck schools are. You've got Terrence Knighton trying to figure out what the hell is up with cinnamon rolls and chili. Those kinds of things that, you just have to figure out when you're in a place that you're not from. And they did a really good job, I think. And Scott Frost and his staff, recruited well in state at the start of their time at Nebraska. But I feel like there's a little bit more of a long game being played here by Matt Rhule's staff beyond just, we're going to get guys in these first couple classes. I think they're really kind of setting the table to be competitive for anybody that's worthy of an FBS offer in the state of Nebraska going forward.
We talked about this a few different times, but one of the things that I've always felt like Nebraska needs to do is treat the state, or at least treat Omaha like you would Miami or Atlanta or St. Louis. And you got to flood it with different coaches. Sending Barrett Ruud to all the different schools for the first couple years was fine. And it helped you get Nick Henrich and Chris Hickman and a handful of guys. But ultimately, every position coach at Nebraska needs to spend time in high schools in Nebraska. But they just have to. They have to be more visible than they were. I love what we saw early on. You have Terrence Knighton, you have Ed Foley, you have Marcus Satterfield, you have Matt Rhule, you have, I can't even think who else would have been there. But they're going through schools in the Metro. They're going through schools in Lincoln. Coaches went into Lincoln High, for the first time in a long time. And that matters. Like, I think it really, really matters to the high school coaches. It matters to these kids. One of the things that when you hear Tristan Alvano and Jalen Lloyd talk, it's not necessarily sour grapes. One thing that maybe I don't do a good enough job when we write about these things, or we write about when kids are on campus, these guys know when they're getting actual face time that matters. They know when they're sort of being pushed off onto a recruiting staff member or onto somebody like that instead of getting a sit down with a position coach. Jalen Lloyd visited Nebraska in March of 2022. He didn't talk to a position coach when he was there. He didn't really talk to anybody that's a full-time on-field staff coach. He talked to some recruiting staffers. Like, they know what that means. They're not, they're not like completely naive into this thing. And so, I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about. It's not that the previous staff weren't aware of who these guys were. There just wasn't the emphasis in terms of building that relationship to the point where when a guy like Jalen Lloyd becomes an offer-worthy player, or when Tristan Alvano is the best kicker that you've got in the state and you've had an issue making field goals for years, like, these are pretty simple. And the relationships at Nebraska would have been better served building earlier under the former staff. But, thankfully for the Huskers going forward, this staff was able to double back and do some good, strong work right away. Looking at kind of everything else, let's get outside of the state here for a moment. 4 signees from the state of Texas. It's long been a conversation. Nebraska has to get back into Texas. I think that's a little bit of a myth as to how much that ultimately matters. But 4 guys out of a state where Matt Rhule has a ton of connections. 4 players that are all really interesting in their own way. I mean, you've got Riley Van Poppel, who I would regard as probably the top player in the class. He'd be the number 1 for my Super 6 right now. Prince Will, Uman Mielen, really intriguing edge rusher. Dylan Rogers, a linebacker the last staff absolutely loved, could play inside, could play outside. This staff seems to have that same sort of belief in him. And then Bryce Turner, the Jalen Lloyd of Texas. So you've got these 4 guys. You got work that they put into the state of Texas. What does that mean to you, Bruntz?
Yeah, I think holding Van Poppel was a big kind of under the radar win for them. I think the fact that they were able to identify a guy like Bryce Turner in Texas just shows, how deep they're willing to evaluate. And obviously he had the relationship with Nebraska track previously, but I think that at least the fact that they're willing to take him as a football player speaks to kind of who they can find in the state. I'm curious with a little bit more of a full recruiting cycle, what that effort kind of looks like. But this is a staff that is really well liked in Texas. I think you even saw the work that Brian Applewhite was doing in Texas bear some fruit there too. So I think there's an opportunity for Nebraska to go in. I don't think you need to pull 6 guys a class out of Texas, but there's enough talent there to go around. And I think if you evaluate well, you lean on your connections a little bit, I think that can be a good state again for Nebraska. I mean, to me, it makes a little bit more sense to go into Texas than say, trying to go elbows out in Ohio or, something like that, where, it doesn't seem like Nebraska's had much luck in the Big Ten era, even when they've had connections in that state. I mean, I think you're going to see more of an effort in Texas. I think Pennsylvania is going to be huge. And I think, New Jersey, DC, I think you're going to see those types of places be a little bit more important for the staff just based on connections and where they've been.
One that we haven't seen a lot of yet, but I'm told that Nebraska is going to get heavily involved. They're going to go back to the West Coast. People need to prepare themselves for this.
Get your Calabrasca out.
The Calabrasca jokes are dead. You can let it go. It's a new time. It's a new era, new coaches. But Tony White's going to be pretty big for them out there. And they've got some other coaches that can recruit out west too. And so, I think we're going to see a lot more in California. I think you're right about Texas. I don't know that we'll see as much in Georgia, maybe as what we saw under Scott Frost. They really made Atlanta a focal point. I'll be curious about that one. But I think you're going to see a lot of Arizona, a lot of California, both North and South California. You might see some Pacific Northwest as well. And then a whole lot of the Midwest and the New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. Can we just call that a turnpike? I know that's not really a turnpike, but it just seems like it should be.
It's not a pipeline; it's a turnpike now.
Yeah,
I don't hate it. We can get somewhere with that. I think
the Nebraska Pike. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of watch this as we finish up here, Bruntz. We got some decisions left today. How you feeling about Vincent Carroll Jackson?
Good. I feel good. I think
feels good.
I think the way that Rhule and his staff they like blitzkrieged Pennsylvania for a couple of days, and he's a guy that's only played football for a year. I think he's got high upside. You have Tony White at Syracuse, where Tony White was at Syracuse. That's where Vincent Carroll Jackson is currently committed. So there's some familiarity at least there. So I think there's a good shot for Nebraska. You mentioned the transfer portal decisions coming up. You've also got as far as January 3rd with Cameron Lenhart announcing his decision at the Under Armour All-American game. Ethan Nation, the defensive back that visited this past weekend, is announcing there too. So this class can continue to grow, and you still are going to have to pay attention into the new year for that. So I think Nebraska's in a good spot. I'm very eager to kind of see how the math all works out on this, and how they get under 85. But there's still plenty of time for attrition there as well to make that happen.
Is there anything left for Wednesday that you're really kind of curious about? Are we just into transfer portal territory? You got Vincent Carroll Jackson, and then it kind of feels like we're looking at guys like Elijah Judy, Cornelius, the Rhode Island tackle, Ben Scott, the offensive lineman from Arizona State. That kind of feels like where we're at is keeping an eye on those guys potentially today.
Yeah, well, I think now Nebraska can you're almost like spot recruiting in the portal. You've got like a very specific list that you're in there looking for, which I'm sure everybody is, but there's still time left on that portal window for guys to enter. And, I think Nebraska can be a little bit more strategic now. And again, you can bring guys in for visits that first weekend in January from the portal. So there's still work to do there. I mean, just kind of looking at what they've gotten done so far, what positions do you think they prioritize most when you're looking ahead to January and potentially adding more guys there?
Well, it certainly feels like they've got to put an emphasis on adding on their offense. I mean, I just don't. I know we haven't talked about it, but Joshua Fleeks is part of this transfer portal class. That's a former Matt Rhule signee at Baylor, and a guy that Nebraska and Scott Frost went after hard in their transition class. And so we'll see what Josh Fleeks ultimately is. He didn't play much past year. We'll see kind of how he can help. I look at it, they got to go find their Samari Toure, Trey Palmer replacement. I mean, I feel like I say this every year, don't love what I'm seeing in the wide receiver room. And they got to go out and add to it. Get Jeff Sims / Casey Thompson / maybe Malik Hornsby / Logan Smothers / Richard Torres / Heinrich Harburg / Jarrett Sinek. Good God, they got a lot of quarterbacks.
Lots of
They got to
slashes.
get a lot of slashes. None of them Cordell Stewart either, I'll point out. They got to get some wide receivers. And I'm very, very interested who becomes a priority there. Or do they just feel like, hey, let's get into the spring and then we'll see what we got with the roster and then we can figure it out in May. I mean, I would think you'd want to have somebody in place this spring.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of guys in the portal after spring ball, but I think you'd want to have a little bit more of a solid idea of what you're working with before you get to that point. It'd be nice too if Nebraska had a wide receivers coach. I think that would kind of clarify things a little bit more.
Interesting.
Apparently, everybody knows who it is. But
I
they're
don't
not
know.
saying. So
no one's telling me.
Yeah. So
I can't tell the people. Sorry, people.
But yeah, they've got to get that spot right. Tight end's another one that I think you got to figure out some a little depth there. Somebody that's played a little bit. So there's some work to do still. It's a good start to this class, but I think they've got some spot recruiting to do.
All right. Anything you want to finish up with here? Any grandiose thought to tie everything together? Have you been studying emoticons lately?
Yeah,
emojis.
I need a better key. Like I need I'm to the point where I'm that age where like I got to get the font really large to see if I can even tell what the heck one of the emojis are. I was like, is that a sheep horn? What are we looking at?
Do we need to go to 247 Sports and ask for like an emoji intern or an emoji translator? Because I mean, this shouldn't come as a big surprise. Two guys in their 30s, BC in his 50s or 40s, whichever it is. Who knows? He's not on the pod. I can make fun of him. We're not the ones that can really translate this. We might have to hire a college student.
Just an emoji turn. That's what we need.
An emoji turn.
Yeah. Here's a grandiose thought. I think for a transition class, I think they've done a really nice job. I think there's a lot to like. I think you've added some talent in some key spots. I think you've got some traitsy guys, Trait City, which I think
Trait City.
What Lincoln might be known as soon, but you've got guys that you can lead speed, really good athletes that you can mold, and that's what Matt Rhule wants. So it's got this class has a little bit of everything for you, and they're not done yet too. So I think you'll get some proven guys in here too out of the portal.
All right. Well, we'll be back later this week with some more on Nebraska's overall class signing day. We'll see if there's any late additions throughout the afternoon here on Wednesday. So keep it locked into Husker247. Be sure to check out Husker247.com. Plenty of coverage. Got stuff on Malachi Coleman, on all of Nebraska's new additions, and we'll have plenty of more because you know what happens next, Bruntz? Contrary to popular belief, recruiting never stops. We'll be moving on to 2024, so we'll be having that conversation. There was a notable quarterback decommitment over the weekend that we haven't even discussed on these podcast airwaves. Maybe we'll be doing that on Thursday. All of that and more can always be found at Husker247.com. We'll be back with more podcast content later this week.